When I first started, no one was calling to tell us, I think I have a chinkapin. He had no clue what this tree was. He had to look it up and find out, well, they are real.
What's the density you're hoping to hit?
5 times more than what a white oak acorn can produce. If I could live that long for that to happen,
Yeah.
that's conservation.
Welcome back to the Ozark Podcast. Our guest made the 5-hour drive to be here in Branson, and we were talking of like, hey, you're going to be a little bit closer. This might be the best place to rendezvous. And that guest is Mr. AJ Hendershott. And AJ, we are excited to talk to you. We're going to be covering the Ozark Chinquapin, which I know you are an expert in. You've spent a lot of hours, a lot of time of your life dedicated to the Ozark Chinquapin. And to start the episode, what I really wanted to do before we get into the facts and the nerdy stuff about the tree and all the history stuff that, you know, people like me and Kyle love to hear about, I wanted to start with, what is the Ozark Chinquapin simply, and why should people who listen who they really just like hunting and they're like, the tree information maybe not for me. If you're a hunter, why should you know about the Ozark Chinquapin?
The Ozark Chinquapin tree is a chestnut relative that produces a nut that has an amazing flavor. Now, that is paramount because it not only tastes good to us, but it tastes good to wildlife, and they will go to it preferentially. So if you are the type of person who wants to manage your land, make it healthy, attract wildlife, you want this tree, especially if you are in the Ozarks, because it is native, it is declining, but we can do something about that. The nuts have amazing nutrition. They are abundant when they produce well, and they outdo an oak in regard to nutrition, production, and they produce way earlier than an oak does. So as a landowner or somebody who's a hunter, you really need to take a keen eye and look at, all right, so what is this tree? What does it need? Where do I need to plant it? What do I need to do to prep the site? And get that on the ground. Because doing that for very selfish reasons, like I did, you're going to get to eat this nut, you're going to attract wildlife, and you're going to do something that's very beneficial for the ecosystem. Well, it's win-win-win all across the board.
Absolutely.
And to me, that's why you need to get interested in this.
You were talking about before we jumped on, and you mentioned nutritionally, it's a superior nut that drops from the tree versus something like a white oak. A lot of times, you know, if you're a deer hunter, you're looking for white oaks, you're looking for that food source on the ground when it comes to whitetail, because you know that's what they go to. That's their chicken nugget of the woods. For this, how does that compare nutritionally as far as protein and some of those more nutritional facts to the white oak acorn?
Okay, so if you take 100 grams of acorns, whether it's white oak or red oak, and look at that, and then you look at 100 grams of the Chinquapin nut, the Ozark Chinquapin, you're comparing nuts to nuts, apples to apples, so to speak, and it's the same measurement. Well, the calorie count, for example, with an Ozark Chinquapin compared to a white oak is like 4 times the amount of calories. So if you eat the same volume of nut as a wildlife species or as a person, you're getting more calories from the Ozark Chinquapin nut. If you look at the protein, it absolutely is 5 times more than what a white oak acorn can produce. So if you're an animal that has to put on weight or needs that protein to, get ready for winter, a bear, a turkey, a deer, an elk, that is going to give you a whole lot more protein than eating the same volume of acorns.
Because an acorn is like, what, 3 to 4% protein? Is that kind of
right?
What I've seen off a white oak?
Yeah.
So a Chinquapin would be anywhere from like 15%
yes.
Protein and more.
I just looked over to check my numbers to make sure I'm telling you right.
Okay.
Yes, that is the case.
That's profound.
It's a huge deal.
I mean, think about all the guys who deer hunt and they spend all that extra money on protein and getting that in their mix. Is like, well, what if you just had a few of these Chinquapins on your landscape for deer, squirrel, turkeys, I assume bears, everything kind of loves these things.
Loves
right?
them. I've even read some reports that were about the American chestnut that I think you could really extrapolate for the Ozarks. They looked at dependable nut sources that have protein and amino acids that they need. If bears don't have enough nutrition, they don't make this decision consciously, but they will abort fetuses into their birthing process. So if you look at the loss of the American chestnut tree, that was a dependable crop. Every year, pretty much, you're going to have a dependable crop. Now, if you think about acorns, we have years when we have a late frost or a freeze, and we lose our white oaks for that fall and the red oaks for the following fall because of how they develop. Well, that happens on a regular basis. We have late freezes here and there, and we have acorn crop failures. You just about don't have that with chestnuts and chinkapins. So now think about, you've just removed that from the ecosystem. Now those bears don't have a dependable crop, and they may or may not give birth every 2 years like they normally would. Well, same thing for deer, same thing for turkey, same thing for animals that have to bulk up to get through the winter. They depend on a dependable crop.
Yeah.
And if they don't have it, now life is a little more tenuous.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that, and not to say that acorns are bad, you got to have them. I've got
Sure.
plenty, and I manage for them on my property. I've got red oaks, I've got white oaks. I'm making sure I have a good balance, but I have some special spots that I put these chinkapins because I want something else in the arsenal.
I love it. I wanted to start there because if my guys who love hunting, if they started and they're like, what are we going to be talking about a tree for an hour for? If you remember nothing else, this is a superior nut to the white oak acorn that we all know is the chicken nugget of the woods, and you got to have these on your property.
Yeah. And I will say, the first time I ate one, that was when I was convinced we have got to bring this tree back.
Yeah, if nothing else, it's a selfish thing, right?
Yeah.
You just let us try one of these here a minute ago, and you were saying these have been baked and they're 2.5 years old, and we just popped two in our mouth, and they're like candy.
I love it.
It didn't matter that they're old; they were delicious. So yeah, you got to have one of these on your property.
Yeah, they're good stuff.
Before we get into the rest of the history, I kind of want to walk through, some of the ecological value, the cultural value, talking through the history of it, what's happened, and then kind of what we're doing about it. But before we go there, maybe just tell people a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. I work over in Southeast Missouri, and I am a outreach and education regional supervisor, and I get to work with all kinds of things, whether it's non-game species, endangered species, hunting species, different clinics for outdoor skills. I teach classes on a variety of things. I make sure that the people that work with me are focusing on the variety of things we're supposed to be doing. Personally, I love to be outside. I just adore being outside. It's a relaxation for me, but I don't have to do any one particular thing. I can hunt, I can fish, I can kayak, I can hike, I can backpack, I can tent camp, just any of that kind of stuff. I am enamored with being outside. It is my medicine. It makes me better. It makes me enjoy what I'm doing. And I like to use natural items to make things. I'm inspired quite a bit by Native Americans and even early settlers because they had figured out how to use some of these plants and animals in ways that are very clever. And I want to walk in their footsteps. I want to see if I have what it takes to do what they did. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's more challenging than I realized. And you read some of this stuff and say, oh, they made this out of it. That's not even the half of it. Oh my gosh, the process they go through. So when I harvest something, when I harvest a deer, I don't just simply use the meat. I use the tendons. I use the hide. I use antlers if I can. If they're a small set of antlers, I'm making tools out of those. I'm going to make atlatl tips or just whatever creative thing is on my mind. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoy the natural history of things. I like to know where things live and grow and how they interact, but I also love to see the cultural history of what were people using this for as far back into antiquity as we can possibly discern it. Mm-hmm. I think it's amazing. And if you look at that kind of stuff, it gives you an appreciation not only for what our woods can do for us, but it also gives you an appreciation for how clever some of these people were to make a living off of that. Yeah. And I'm talking about the Osage people or, the Quapaw or something like that. They are doing fantastic and amazing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gives you a tie to the land, too. I know that you may not be a direct descendant of the Osage or the Quapaw, and you might be. But you also are like, well, these are how the people before me survived. Do I have what it takes, kind of? Yeah. And it's like, I may have some of what it takes. Yeah. That ties you back to the place that you love, and that's a more interesting way to live.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love that. So for you, with what you do with MDC, how did that attach you or connect you with the Ozark Chinquapin Foundation, and really just how did the Chinquapin Foundation get started?
It got started several years back with Steve Boss talking to a gentleman named Harold Adams, who was probably in his late 80s. And he was hunting at a camp that Steve was at, and he said something in a matter of conversation about chinkapins. And he said, I'm sorry, do what? And Harold Adams began to tell him all about this tree that was so vital and important and produced so many nuts, you'd have to scoop them up with a flat blade shovel to put them into a wagon. And Steve was a very accomplished naturalist. He worked for the Department of Natural Resources. He had no clue what this tree was. He had to look it up and find out, well, they are real. They did exist. And he asked another naturalist about it, and they said, "You're hunting a ghost. These things are long gone." Well, he's not the kind of guy to get turned around easy. So he kept looking, and he eventually started finding them. The next thing you know, he's asking people like me, "Have you heard about the Ozark Chinquapin Foundation?" I did the same thing he did. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So he gives me a nut, and I try it, and I say, "Oh my gosh, we got to do something about this." So this foundation started with a room full of people. It was five people in a room. And the next thing you know, we've now got meetings where we can have anywhere from 80 to 150 people
Wow.
that are there to learn more about what we're doing, what's going on with the genetics, what's going on with historic uses, what's going on with just all sorts of things. And that is amazing because we're chasing our 20th year here pretty quick. I am shocked at what we've been able to accomplish in that amount of time. So the bottom line is this has fallen in my lap. This is not something that I made happen. This is just something I have been able to say, I feel like I can contribute to this, and I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And we have other people that have done the same thing, and we're seeing more and more people do that. When I first started, no one was calling to tell us, "I think I have a Chinquapin." Now on Facebook, about once a month, I get a tree that I look at and go, "I think you have a Chinquapin. Would you mind if somebody were to check it out, gather pollen, collect seeds, or get a leaf sample for genetic testing or disease blight resistance testing?" And it's growing and it's continuing to get bigger all the time. And I look at that and think, wow, we have been a part of something.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
So what is the goal then? For if you could boil down the goal of the foundation in a couple words, what would you say is what you're marching towards?
We are going to restore, if possible, 100% pure Ozark Chinquapin genetically across its native range.
Okay.
We want to bring it back where it belongs. We're not crossbreeding it with something else like the Chinese chestnut. We're not picking at people that do. We're just saying this is our goals. We are trying to bring back 100% pure Ozark Chinquapins.
And if that happens, like in theory, one day, I think I heard you say this on another podcast as I was kind of researching. In theory, one day it's like we don't need the foundation anymore because they're everywhere. They're back where they're supposed to be, and like that would actually be a dream for you, right?
Yes, if I could live that long for that to happen.
Yeah.
That's conservation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That when you can get the people, just the public and the people involved in a conservation initiative to the point that you don't even need the people at the helm, like, organizing these small meetings and things like that. That's when you've achieved something because you've taught about the value, you've taught about, why this matters and how to actually replace them and put them back on the landscape. That's beautiful, man. I love it. I love it.
Before we talk about the value, and I know that's where we're headed, when you say across the native range, what's the density you're hoping to hit? I mean, if you have oaks,
Excellent question.
they're just covered.
Pollen records tell us that the Ozark Chinquapin was about as common as the white ash, and the white ash makes up about 2% of most of our Ozark forests.
Okay.
Depending on where you are and watersheds, it can vary, but 2% is a goal.
Okay.
Now, that's a lot of trees.
Yeah.
That is nothing to sneeze at. And when you look at how many hundreds of thousands and millions of trees live in the Ozarks, 2% is a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of work to do, but you know what? I'm not thinking small. If this goal is worth doing, let's bring it back.
Absolutely.
Let's not bring back some little refuge of it that we have to protect, so greatly. Let's make sure it's everywhere. So if you have a forest fire, it doesn't destroy the whole thing. You've got it everywhere else. It's like putting your Easter eggs all over the place instead of just one basket.
Yeah. What is the historical range? Obviously, the Ozarks has, the boundaries is kind of clear of what the Ozarks are, but does it range outside of the Ozarks? I think I've heard you talk about.
It does, and that's something that has surprised us a little bit. We knew that it occurred in Mississippi and Alabama, and there's some discussion about whether there might be a separate species in Alabama. But that aside, we're also seeing legitimate samples of this come up in Florida, Georgia, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and even Kentucky. And we have some records that might indicate we have some in Tennessee. Haven't verified that other than historical records. So it has been all over the eastern United States, and then obviously it is the chestnut, the chestnut tree over here in the Ozarks.
Okay.
Now we have the Allegheny, which is a bush, maybe 20, 25 feet tall. But if you're getting something that's 40, 50, 80 feet tall, that's an Ozark Chinquapin.
Talk me through the story. For anyone who doesn't know the history of the Ozark Chinquapin, what happened to it? I think you had already mentioned blight and just the disease that happened. Talk me through just like the progression over time of, they were everywhere. What happened, and how long has it been since then?
Okay. There was an instance in the Bronx Zoo in the early 1900s, and I'm talking, I want to say 1904, 1909, something like that. I'd have to go back and look, but it's early 1900s. Someone on the Bronx Zoo notices that their chestnut trees are starting to die back. And long story short, they figure out it is a blight that is native to China. And it was probably brought over with Chinese chestnut trees, which have grown up with that metaphorically.
Okay.
So they are susceptible to it, but not to the point that they really get hurt as badly. So they can live with it. It's kind of like you and I having the flu. We don't do well with it, but we don't die from it typically.
Sure.
So that's the kind of way that the Chinese chestnut works with it. Well, the
And a
American
blight is just it's a type of disease.
Yeah, it's a fungus that gets in the bark, and there has to be a little bit of damage on the bark, like if a squirrel went up or there's a little storm damage or somebody backed a vehicle into the tree. That's a perfect place for a spore to get in there, and then it starts growing on the inside around the inner bark. And then what that does, it produces oxalic acid, which is a chemical that some plants can handle. Strawberries can handle it. Wheat plants can handle it, but when you put that in the cells of an Ozark Chinquapin tree that's actively growing or a chestnut tree, they can't handle it and they die. What typically happens is the tree dies and then it will start to stump sprout. It'll grow out of those stump sprouts for 10 years, get the blight again, die back, and then it'll keep doing that over and over and over again. So these trees do not look great. They might bloom, they might produce seeds, but typically they're not going to do very well because that blight is there and it's going to continue to hit them constantly over and over again on about every 10-year cycle.
Okay.
Same thing kind of happens with the American chestnut. They get blighted, they die back. I don't know if they stump sprout as much. I'm not an expert on that. I just know that with our Ozark Chinquapins, that's how it works.
Okay.
All right, so what we're finding is that has decimated the vast majority of these Ozark Chinquapins, but it didn't do it straight away. So it started in the Bronx Zoo, and then it was like an ocean wave. It started to ripple out, and eventually by the 1950s, it got into the Ozarks. And so that's when even people today that are 80 and 90 years old remember, all of our Chinquapins died, and they can tell us about that.
So the old timers that are still around today, they still have stories of being a kid and eating the Chinquapin nuts out of the backyard or in the woods.
Yeah.
Okay.
They certainly do. And we've done a good job of recording some of those stories, but we don't have them all. And every time I do an interview, I learn something new. And I wish I could do more of it. I really do, because these people know stuff that otherwise we're not going to ever know. And I can give you an example of how did they preserve the nuts. Well, some people tell you, well, we didn't preserve them at all. We just ate them. The next person you talk to said, oh, we baked them. Oh, you did? Well, how'd you do that? And then the next person you talk to said, oh, we put chloroform on them to kill all the weevil eggs. You did what? I mean, just stuff like that here's something one person did or, a small group of people. And I wish I could do more of those interviews because those are the people that really know what to do with these Ozark Chinquapins. But anyways, so that blight has gotten around and it's caused a lot of damage. What we're seeing now is that not every tree totally dies. If we go to a patch, and for example, there's one in Oregon County, Missouri, and I found several trees along with several folks that had seen them before, and I'm looking around and I see all these blighted trees. Ozark Chinquapins are not much taller than you and I. But then we find one tree that's 30 or 40 feet tall. Well, why is that one tree doing well when 100 other trees nearby are all sick and dying and have shown symptoms of it for decades? It's because they are showing some blight resistance. The kicker is you don't have another tree around there to breed with that's got the same level of blight resistance, so it really doesn't go anywhere.
You got one blight-resistant tree in a patch of many that are not resistant to the blight.
Right.
So they can't reproduce and make blight-resistant.
Not really well.
Okay.
Not well.
You have to have a second blight-resistant tree nearby enough to be pollinated.
And that's what we stumbled on. We started crossing a tree that was maybe in another county or across state lines, and we start getting those crossed. And the next thing you know, we're growing those trees, and within just a few years, we can do a blight test where we take a little sample of the leaf, we put the blight on there, and we measure how fast it grows and how much it consumes. And what we're finding is that some of those Ozark Chinquapin trees that have been crossed with another healthy tree, they are as blight resistant as the Chinese chestnut, and in some cases more resistant than the Chinese chestnut.
Really?
Yes, which blows my mind because in less than 20 years we've been able to scientifically say this is what's going on. I never would have expected that to happen quite so quickly for us to say we have a viable option. So I'm excited. So what that means now is we have something to put in the woods, and take care of it. Make sure you have given it every positive chance to grow. And then those trees are going to be the ones that produce the next generation, and you continue to get that. The ultimate goal in my mind is to now take that and put it around these trees that are sick. It's not going to cure those trees, but what it does is it gives you some of those genetic traits that those trees have that are not showing themselves as important. For example, maybe one tree has better chloroplast efficiency, or it's more drought resistant, or it blooms just a little bit later and would not be susceptible to a frost. All of this kind of stuff matters, but the tree doesn't get old enough to really show its true genetic variability. But if you can start getting these blight resistant trees bred in with the other ones, the next thing you know, you now have a very genetically diverse group of trees that are some and most are going to be able to resist the blight. And you don't have a genetic bottleneck, which makes it really hard on the trees. I think that is a very worthy goal, and that's where I want to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes 2% across the Ozark Natural Range so much more exciting too, because it's not just a fool's errand of let's grow trees and see what happens.
Yeah.
It's backed by decades of science, which we knew we were getting into as we stepped into this. With blight-resistant trees, saying if we're bringing it back better, stronger, healthier, more genetically diverse, but hopefully just as dense as they used to be.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, when you're, and you mentioned talking to old timers and having these historical records, that you're, in some ways you're basing off of like, here's what we would like to get back to, like kind of a baseline. When you look back in history, do you see cultural significance around the Ozark Chinquapin in the way that, you know, people had stories about them? There were traditions, things that the wood was used for to make different things like that. I see, you know, you've brought some props here that we can show off to the cameras here. But stuff like that, I'm curious, culturally, does the Ozark Chinquapin have a lot of value in the Ozarks?
It does. One of the first ones I hear all the time is fences. So you think about split rail fences or even barbed wire fences that have a post. The Chinquapin wood was preferentially sought because it was rot resistant, just like black locust or Osage orange. So and it's also very easy to split. So it was used for fences on a regular basis, but it was also easy enough to make into shingles. So a lot of your Ozark cabins would have been shingled with Ozark Chinquapin wood.
Really? No way.
Yeah, and they would last for at least 20 years, maybe even longer, depending on how well you made your shingles. Whereas if you use post oak or white oak, they may not last a whole lot more than 10, 15 years and then have to be replaced. So you're looking at a wood that was very popular for that. They were used for coffins because you can put them in the ground. They're going to stay for a very long time. They are beautiful wood, as you can see by looking at it. It's a gorgeous wood, and there's a lot of variety in it. I've seen some very blonde wood. I've seen some that's got a lot of texture, visual texture. And I just look at that and think, what couldn't you make out of this?
Yeah. How does it compare in terms of density to, you know, like hickories and oaks? And I mean, you talked about being resistant to rot and things like that, but just as far as ease of working with the wood, and I know you do a lot with, like you make a lot of different things with the wood. You make longbows and things like that. How do you compare it to other woods?
Okay. When I made the bow, that was a project where I've never seen or heard anything that says that people used the Chinquapin wood to make a bow. So now I'm just stepping out on, I'm curious, I'm a bow maker, I can't not do this. So I did. I found that it was very easy to work with a draw knife. It worked great, and it was comparable to working oak, for example.
Okay.
But one thing that I saw very different when I was doing very fine work, and what I mean by that is I'm taking off thin layers that essentially are so thin you can see daylight through them. I'm using a cabinet scraper to do this. It's just a piece of metal, rectangular. It's got a little burr on it, and I pull that across. On hickory, it just shaves off ribbons. On Ozark Chinquapin, it compressed and it got smoother and more difficult for me to pull anything off of it. So I had difficulty making the bow. I would have to rough the wood up and then scrape it, and it took me almost double the amount of time to do the tillering where I bend the limbs and make them do what they're supposed to do. So there's a little bit of difference there, but from the standpoint of just making things, for example, I made this trencher bowl out of a tree that was very fresh. We had to take it down because of its genetics. Otherwise, I don't take Chinquapins down unless they have already died.
Yeah.
But this one was green, and that means it hasn't seasoned. It was amazingly easy to work, and it was fantastic. As soon as it dried, it was as hard, if not harder than oak. So it was one of those things that I realized if I want to make another trencher bowl, it's got to be out of green wood. And when I say green, I mean unseasoned. So it's a neat wood. You just got to learn a little bit about it. But once you get it and you make something, it's just eye candy. I look at that and I cannot get over it sometimes. I just look at it and say it's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as some of the other like cultural significance and value, you mentioned, having historical records of people mentioning the Chinquapin in stories and in games, different things that they would use like the nuts for. Maybe just share a few of those if you don't mind.
Okay, there is a game called Hully Gully, and that is one that I hear about all over the Ozarks. And it was a gambling game for kids back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so they would gather these nuts, and if they had pockets, they would put them in their pockets. The girls would have maybe aprons on their dress, and they would collect those. That would be their lunch. But it was also their fun. They would gamble with these nuts, and you would have a certain number in your hand, and it was a guessing game. And if you had, let's say, 5 and you guessed wrong, then you owed that person the difference on how many Chinquapins were in there. If they got them right, they got all your Chinquapins. So you could lose your lunch over this whole process. And that was a game that was very common all across the United States, but it was done in particular a lot with the Chinquapins because the kids could eat them, they could crack them. And during the Depression era, that was their lunch. They didn't have a lot to take to school with them, so that was a big deal.
Yeah.
But even some of the other stories on stuff, I read a newspaper article that said that somebody had a dress that was very dull, and her mother took Chinquapin bark and dyed it purple. Well, after I read that, I went, okay, I got to learn how to dye. So I go through the whole process of learning how to do natural dyes, and then I'm able to get some limbs that we had to take off the trees for maintenance purposes. Got that, started working on it, and went, well, I wonder if you could do this with leaves. I wonder if you could do this with burrs. And the next thing you know, I have all kinds of yarn and cloth dyed with this, and I'm starting to realize, well, you could do more than just make purple. You can make an olive drab green, you can make tan, you can make a light tan, and there's just all kinds of opportunities.
Wow.
So I have here today, I have this powder horn strap, which the purple on here is from Ozark Chinquapin dye. The yellow is from Osage orange, the wood.
Okay.
So it's completely dyed that way.
Very cool.
I also have a cloth down there that was done. It's cotton.
You're not afraid to just like pick something up and go for it.
Yeah, and sometimes it'll take me a year or two to figure out what I'm doing to then turn around and say, okay, let's do the experiment now.
Is this like a black walnut where it's going to dye it dark? Or you're saying the leaves are different color and the bark's a different color?
And it depends on what kind of mordant, which is a whole different discussion, like what you put in there along with it to either make it darker and sadder or brighter and more vibrant.
Okay.
Or you just put something in there that makes it tend to go a little more green.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways to make these things do that. I've been able to do probably 16 different colors using our mostly sustainable Ozark Chinquapin parts. Now, the bark is a little different. You take the bark off, that's not sustainable. But the leaves, I can collect that as soon as the fall hits. I can collect the burrs off the ground. And, I mean, it's just fantastic, all the stuff you can do.
That is so cool. And about, I don't know, 1,000 years from now, they're gonna dig all our stuff up, and they're gonna find your horn, and it's gonna say AJ Hendershott, his horn, and they're gonna be like, this guy was like living 300, 400 years late, and he was like still hunting with a horn when everyone else had cell phones, and they're gonna remember you, AJ.
I hope so. Yeah.
Let me see that.
Now, this spear thrower, the reason I made that is not arbitrary. There were some spear throwers found in northwest Arkansas, southwest Missouri, and they were in a bluff dweller culture, which was archaic and woodland. So if you look that up, you're getting into maybe 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. And there were 3 or 4 partial or whole atlatls, and the archaeologists that looked at that said, I think part of the reason these were preserved is because it's in a dry cave or shelter.
Okay.
But the other part of it is because this is rot-resistant wood made of Ozark Chinquapin.
Oh, okay.
So when I read that, I communicated with this guy, and he says, I even went out and I made one of these. It looks very similar. So he's looking at modern-day replicas as well. Well, that's what I did as well. Part of what I'm trying to do with these things is to communicate value above and beyond just the value of the nut. I'm trying to show people have used this for all kinds of amazing projects, and you can still do it today, if nothing else, to appreciate the past. But some of it, I can hunt with that atlatl.
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with that.
And you have.
Yeah.
You have. And you were successful in harvesting a rabbit.
A rabbit, yes.
Okay.
A very frozen but not frozen, but very scared in his place rabbit. If he hadn't stayed still, I'm sure I wouldn't have been successful. But
It's pretty cool.
and it's a thrill to be able to use some of these things and say, yeah, I pulled that off.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any species that depend on the chinkapin that we've seen disappear, or that just kind of are a helper to the chinkapin that you guys are aware of in your research?
The chinkapin tree it's pollinated by two modes. One is wind and the other is insects. The flowers have quite a bit of nectar and they have an aroma. It's very distinctive. You can smell it 15, 20 yards away from the tree. They are loaded with insects. There are some butterflies that we are aware of that have been found on chinkapins and maybe one other species of plant, and that's it. And right now there's a butterfly that the name is escaping me, but the bottom line is there are some species that when they're gone, when the trees are gone, then they're gone. Two more are the greater and the lesser chestnut weevil. They used to be abundant in the Ozarks, and now you really don't find a lot of them. Now, we still have weevils for other things like oaks, but as far as the chestnut weevils, we don't have a lot. Now, that's kind of like saying we're about to lose a tick or a mosquito. They essentially burrow into the nut, and if you're trying to eat the nut or use them commercially or something like that, they would be a challenge for you. But at the same time, that weevil has connections that we don't fully understand. So to say that something has absolutely no value is pretty arrogant, in my opinion. So yes, there are some things that depend on these Ozark Chinquapin trees, but there are also some mammals that do better because of Chinquapin trees. I talked to you earlier about bears. Bears really do need to have good nutrition, especially female bears that are carrying their young and they give birth in the middle of winter.
Right.
Well, if they don't have good nutrition, eventually they don't make this decision consciously, but they will abort the fetus. Now, that's something that if you don't have good nut production on a regular basis, that is a risk on a fairly common basis.
Yeah.
The reason the chinkapins are more dependable is because they bloom later. Instead of blooming in March or April, they bloom in the middle of May or June, and they're less susceptible to any kind of frost. And because they're wind and insect pollinated, they have two modes. They're just about always going to get pollinated, and then they produce their nuts in a short amount of time. By September, like the second week of September, most of us are seeing nuts. Well, that's pretty dependable. So if you are an animal that needs that, that's pretty important. But it's more than that. They outproduce the same sized oak tree. So you will get more nuts off of a tree that's 40 feet tall than what you will an oak tree that's 40 feet tall.
Yeah.
So they outcompete in the amount of nuts, they outcompete on dependability of nut production, and they outcompete on nutrition.
Yeah.
So you think about all the connections to mice and birds, blue jays, crows, chipmunks. All of these animals don't have this food in the cupboard anymore. So what effect does that have? Yeah.
And they used to. That's the thing. And it's interesting you bring up the bears. Kyle and I have gotten the opportunity to go on some bear den visits.
Awesome.
And in the last 2 years, both years we saw a sow that had one cub, and it was essentially we were talking with Myron, he was talking about the impacts of the droughts that we've had in recent years and how that's, accelerated the acorn crop to drop sooner.
Yes.
And so that's impacted the sow's abilities to have those cubs. And so when you have that, like you're talking about, I mean, we've seen it firsthand is why I'm bringing this up. It's just interesting to see that actually correlate into very real impacts on the landscape. Whereas potentially you can make the case that if there had been chinkapins in this area, you could have had that same sow both different sows the last 2 years having 2 or even 3 cubs, which they can have sometimes too. So that's like
There's a much better chance of them having 2.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if she's fed enough. There's enough food in the landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's what they're supposed to have. It seems
Exactly.
like, so.
And here's something new that we've been watching. We are starting to see whippoorwills around some of our orchards. Now, the interesting thing about this, they timed all of their nesting so that the nest and the eggs will hatch at a full moon phase. Now, when a flower is white, that tends to be a plant that attracts nighttime pollinators. Ozark Chinquapin flowers are white, and we are starting to figure out that there is a night shift of certain beetles come in at this time of night, moths come in at this type of night, and we're starting to see this whole range of stuff that we had no idea was going on. Well, now we're kicking up, without meaning to, whippoorwills that are camped out close to our Chinquapin orchards because they are feeding whenever the moon is full over our Chinquapins and eating all these bugs. And what were they eating before, or what do they eat now without chinkapins? I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't really know enough to say, but it makes me curious, and it makes me excited to think, well, are we benefiting these animals?
Right.
So stuff like that, to answer your question, I think there's a lot out there that we know, and there's a whole lot more out there we don't know.
Yeah.
Because we don't know what we've missed. We don't have that baseline data. We're figuring some of this stuff out after the fact, and we go, okay, we've almost lost it. What have we lost? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think one of the facts of the podcast is that a 40-foot oak tree, white oak, and a 40-foot chinkapin tree, that nut is going to have, is it 4 times the calories and 5 times the protein?
4 times the calories, yes, and 4 times the protein, 5 times the carbohydrates.
That's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just thinking bears getting fat, bucks getting big,
Yeah.
antler growth, all of it. I mean, you're just total wildlife health.
And you mentioned too time to maturity too, right?
Yeah.
So like how long does a white oak take to grow to where it's actually dropping acorns?
It's probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 years. So then you look at your Ozark Chinquapin, if it's a healthy tree, and I'm just saying average, they can start producing male flowers in 3 years and female flowers in 5, and you will have nuts that year if you have another tree nearby.
Okay.
Even though they make they make both male and female flowers on one tree, and they all do it, they don't self-pollinate very well. So you have to have more than one tree, and they need to be fairly close. I don't mean 20 feet apart necessarily, although that doesn't hurt. But if you have them, an eighth of a mile apart, they will get pollinated. I have some trees like that in a county park over in Cape Girardeau, and they pollinate each other very well.
Okay.
So 10 years earlier, you're getting food on the ground.
Yes.
And then you're getting 4 to 5 times the amount, the calorie density, and all of the benefits. for all
You've
the
got
animals. That's why.
I mean, if
the Ozark Chinquapin, that's why we want it covering the entirety of the
if
landscape.
nothing else, if you don't hear anything else, hear that. Because to get these, it's a real thing to actually get these back on the landscape. You could see a quick turnaround in the benefits of these things that we're talking about.
Now, here's a couple qualifications. So let's say you're convinced you want to do this.
Yeah.
They don't like clay.
Okay.
It's going to be too wet for too long, and it can starve them of oxygen on their roots. They love the rockiest, most obnoxious soil. It's dry. It's hard to get anything to grow on it, and they say, watch this. And so if you get a nut, and what I'll do is I'll drive down a rebar or something like that, and I get that down far enough, put some sand in there, and put the nut right over that hole with the sand, and then that root goes just straight down, and it'll grow several feet within the first year. And then that tree has the best chance of taking off and getting going. So if it's a good place for pine, it's probably going to be a good place for Ozark Chinquapin, so long as it's not full of clay.
Okay.
If there's clay, that red clay that doesn't drain very well, the trees are going to struggle.
Okay.
They really are. They don't like clay.
So you need to be kind of aware of the property that you're thinking about maybe putting these on, like the conditions of it. So ideal conditions would be a rocky kind of dry soil.
Yeah.
To
does
the
it?
Ozark Mountains.
I mean,
Yeah, the Ozarks,
that's a lot of places.
You're describing that as like, man, do I have a hunting property for you to see?
What about like sun exposure? Is it you want to be in the full sun? Do you want to be somewhere in the canopy?
Full sun is fantastic. So if you want to plant these, and you're going to get involved and you're going to get your seed like everyone else does from the foundation in, say, January, February, or something like that, do the work now to prep the site.
Okay.
So if you have trees that are not preferential, for example, and I have nothing against elms and ash, I want to make sure they are on my property, but I don't want them to be what dominates my property.
Okay.
So I might cut those. I might treat the stumps if necessary. I'm going to make sure that this is nice and sunny, and I'm talking about like a half-acre opening. I'm not talking about just cutting 2 or 3 trees and that'll be enough. No, I want full sun on these trees, not partial. And they will do the best with that. They can absolutely be in the hottest, most aggressive territory you can imagine, and they do great. They need a little bit of water that first year, maybe the second, but after that, they do phenomenal.
Okay, gotcha. So they're pretty. After you get past the sapling stage, they're pretty hardy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now here's a tip. Let's say you put them up on a ridge top, and it's way away from your water spigot. Got a couple deals for you. All right, so go get you one of those plastic tubs with a lid that's got the recess on the top. Drill holes in it. So every time it rains, water filters down through that lid and collects in there. So when you go up to the ridge top, you pop that lid off with a pitcher, and then you go water your trees. let nature still do it, but you've got that. It also doesn't raise mosquitoes, and it doesn't evaporate because the sun's drying it out. You just keep that lid on there, and that's one way we supplement our watering without having to haul water up the hill on a regular basis.
Okay. So right now with you guys, so you have people report to you, hey, I think I might have one, or I do have one. You guys go out and confirm it. What is the process? If someone's listening, they think, well, maybe I have one, or maybe I'm not sure if I have one. What's the process for someone to kind of report that and get someone to come verify it?
They can do it through our website by email, or they can do it through Facebook. We do Facebook Messenger. I run that particular aspect of the foundation. And what I'll ask for is, can you provide me with pictures of the leaf, the nut, if there's a spiny burr, the bark, the whole tree? Just give me as many pictures that are good quality as you can. And like, for example, when you've got the burr or the nuts, put something by it, a pocket knife, a dollar bill, a coin, something that you have in your pocket that I can say, okay, I see that this is a very large burr versus a very small burr. Mm-hmm. And then I can usually get a better idea and say, okay, I think what you have here is a Chinquapin oak because it has acorn caps. Or I can say this has a very large burr, it's a Chinese chestnut. Or there are times now I'm getting them and I say, hey, I think you have an Ozark Chinquapin. Now, if it's one that's been blighted and it's obviously stump sprouting, I might say, here's what you can do. Cut the trees around it. Give it sunlight. Give it extra water from the standpoint of no competition. And that tree will do better. And then get some seed from us and plant that nearby. So that's a really good thing.
So you would actually suggest someone plant these seeds nearby a blighted Chinquapin?
Sure.
Even though you know that has the blight?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're going to have these trees that we're providing from seed are going to get the blight exposed to them.
Okay.
It's just going to happen. The blight lives on sumac trees, and it even lives on certain oaks trees. So it's not like because the Ozark Chinquapin's been gone from your area for so long that the blight doesn't exist. It's still there. It's going to show up on your trees. So, yeah, put it there. It's going to be exposed to the blight. It's got the better chance of including its genetics in that other tree if it blooms. And then when you do that, you're getting a much more robust genetic diversity, and you're getting some nuts that you can use, and those are the ones that are going to be blight resistant. And you're getting all the other stuff that they might have, whether it's nut size or color or leaves, leaf shape, or efficiency of whatever biological process they have in their bodies. I mean, it's just fantastic, the opportunity that you have to restore the species.